I found death along Hatchman Trail. Written by Jackson Arthur. I shot from the building like a bullet. In those days, I was usually one of the first people to escape middle school after the bell rang. I always tried to move swiftly out of the double doors because I like to avoid the other kids in my school, the ones gathering for the buses or the ones who had to walk home. Like me. I always wanted to be alone, whenever possible. Not because other people didn't like me, but because I just didn't like them. They never understood me, and neither will you. I remember that day as being abnormally hot and muggy for April. The sky was also an unusually crisp blue, especially for northeastern Ohio, which was known for having far more cloudy and overcast days during the year. The school's central air unit must have been cranked up, because when I exited the building, the drastic change in temperature nearly took my breath away. It was almost like I was leaving a chilly refrigerator to jump headfirst into a hot pool. I was nearly stopped in my tracks by the sudden blast of heat and humidity, but once I was out the doors, I kept moving full speed. I clearly recall how my upper body, most of all the flesh beneath my black long-sleeve shirt, instantly broke out in pools of sweat, causing me to instinctively pull up on my sleeves. That was what a normal kid would do. I didn't think about it. I just reacted. As I began tugging on the left sleeve though, I pulled it high enough to catch a brief glimpse at one of those fabulous oval scars on my right arm. The one that I had caught sight of that day was old and white, mostly healed. It actually wasn't a full circle, now that I think about it. More like a half or quarter moon. Quickly, I scanned around me for any possible onlookers before pushing the sleeve back down to my wrist. I pushed the heat from my mind and kept moving. Instead of turning right from the main entrance towards the school's parking lot and further to the main drag, which was a walker's normal way home after school, I had decided to cut a hard left towards the opposite side of the building. In a small town like Oak Hill, a lot of kids walk home from school. Everything, not just the elementary, middle, and high schools, were within walking distance in a tiny town like that. The grocery stores, banks, police, and fire departments, bars, and churches, all were within a brisk stroll from anywhere else in town. Along the left side of the school, I swiftly moved across the basketball court, around the set of swings, before beginning my trek towards the tree line on the other side of the soccer field. Behind the middle school was a dense patch of woods. Back before Oak Hill was dug out and established, the entire area of land had been forest. Or so I had been told most of my life. The town founders, or whoever built the town, didn't remove the entire forest for some reason, but left a strip of trees. The trees were like an unspoken dividing line running through the middle of town. On one side you had the small town businesses, along with all of the town's nice homes and nice happy families. On the other side of the trees, you had the projects. Worn out two-story apartment buildings filled with people living in state housing units, drug pushers, addicts, and the poor welfare bums. I bet you can guess on which side of the trees I had lived. Projects. Back then I was living with my mother. I couldn't even venture a guess as to where my father was then, or where he might be now. In all of my life, I had never met the man, and I don't know anything about that bastard, or if he is even still breathing. It doesn't matter. In theory, going through the woods would have put me on a more direct path to my apartment, getting me home quicker than going along the main road. The main road always took me out and around the trees, instead of in a straight line to my home. But going through the woods was not about getting home faster. It was about slowing down, stalling the inevitable. I knew that I had to get there at some point, but I was rarely in a hurry, especially on that day. That afternoon, I had zero desire to get home any faster than necessary. When I had left for school that morning, my mother had already opened her bottle of the day. It had been a dark amber alcohol, nearly black in color. Dark liquid usually meant that the day would be bad, worse than usual. I figured that maybe by lollygagging through the woods, Mother would be passed out on the couch by the time I got home. I had hoped anyway.
Hope in one hand, shit in the other, and see which fills faster,
my mother sometimes said. I can almost laugh at that thought as I sit here writing this. I could have taken all the time I wanted. She didn't care, or pay attention to where I was, or when I would be home. No, that wasn't completely true. She cared enough about me to occasionally notice my existence, but that was only when I was within her line of sight. I still have proof of that up and down my arms. It meant that the more I stayed out of her sight, the better it was for me, which was why I often went through the woods back then. I enjoyed it too, I will admit, especially during the spring and summer, when the world finally began to thaw. During the winter, apart from it being bitterly cold, it was also depressing to walk through the trees when they were barren. It didn't remind me of death, but of an emotion similar to emptiness. Thoughts of death never bothered me, but the sense of hopelessness I got during the winter would take me to internal places that were dark and endless. Little did I know then, but I would someday come to appreciate those same dark places. Whenever I cut through the woods, I didn't just stomp or trudge aimlessly from one side to the other. There was a beaten routine I took, a worn path that everyone in town called Hatchetman Trail. There were a bunch of old stories about that specific path. According to most of the tall tales that I have heard, there once had been a strange man who used to hide back in those woods, sometime during the 1970s. He liked to snatch up any kid who made the mistake of going beyond the tree line. He would then hang them from a sturdy branch so that he could hack at them with a hatchet, as if the kid was a party piñata filled with treats. Obviously, those stories were complete bullshit. Every town in America had its own version of the boogeyman, or Hatchetman, meant to keep dumb little kids from wandering into the woods. Or so I had thought. As I arrived at Hatchetman Trail, I stopped for a second at its head. I couldn't hold back a slight feeling of anxiety mixed with adrenaline. The tall tales were bullshit, but somewhere behind the logic sections of my brain, I wondered what would happen if they were true. What if Hatchetman was real? What if he didn't exist in the 70s, but right then, and he was watching me from behind a large tree, waiting for me? Would I be able to make it the full run of the trail before he got me? Would he tie me up and spill my guts onto the dirt? The sensations flowing through my head made me feel alive. I was brave and tough. I would face the trail no matter what dangers I might find. I stepped onto the path and silently dared Hatchetman to give it his best try. The stretch of the forest was not very wide, but when the leaves and grass and weeds began to fill in the spaces between the trees, it became dense with green foliage and black shadows. Only fragments of sunlight managed to make it all the way to the ground. Once I was inside, it was easy to lose myself completely, forgetting about everything else that might exist beyond the tree line. There was nothing else. No Oak Hill, no other people, no mother. There was only me. I often went entirely into my fantasy world while on the trail. Occasionally, the real world would break through though. As you probably guessed, there were other people that would use the trail. Sometimes. I would often see signs of them along the way. Discarded cigarette butts or beer cans. One time, I saw 2 high school seniors, both girls, making out and rubbing on each other against a tree several feet from the path. How disgusting. But most of the time, like that specific day, I was alone. Hatchetman Trail was not a straight line through the woods. You could follow it for a ways, twisting and turning, before eventually getting to the other side, where you would come out a few yards away from a row of apartment buildings. It wasn't a straight line, but it was a single path. No split-offs or forks, except for some reason, that particular afternoon. I had been taking my time, as always, walking slow and steady. The shadows and the shade were drying and cooling me down. It felt nice and calming to both my flesh and my mind. I eventually reached the deepest point of the trail, and from then on, I would be making my way outward, instead of in. Something unexpected made me instantly halt. Hatchetman Trail didn't just continue its normal route towards the other side, but it suddenly split. A new path moving off to my right. I stood and stared for nearly a minute, confused. What was happening? Had I taken a different path somehow? Was there more than one way through the woods? I can't explain what I was thinking when I began to follow this new path. Instead of just going home, I don't know why I didn't question this oddity further. None of that makes a difference now. I can't explain the decision of that young man, because taking that impossible new path changed me into someone different. I can't explain the decisions of that person because I am no longer that person. I don't believe that I went all that far. A few yards maybe? But at the time, it felt like I was 100 miles away from where I had been. The air smelled different. Cleaner somehow. The trunks of the trees were wider, broader, and possibly a darker shade of brown. And even the sky seemed different. Above the swaying branches, the crisp blue had been replaced by dark gray clouds. It was gonna rain. I could feel my skin anticipating it. Also, Oak Hill was always a very flat town. Yet, on this new path, I found the land sharply rising. This new path began to lead me up the side of a tall, steep hill. As I continued to move, the muscles in my legs started to burn with exertion. My breathing turned sharp and forced. I wasn't used to the effort. At the top of the steep hill, the impossible path abruptly ended. My tired lungs wanted to take in air as fast as they could, but instead, I clamped my lips shut and held my breath. Every muscle of my body froze still. I found myself at the edges of a small circular clearing. The sad gray sky above me was now fully exposed, and it was obviously about to cry large, wet tears. At the center of the clearing grew the most massive tree I had ever seen, but it wasn't the overly large tree or the sad sky that had stolen my breath and my movement. It was the sight of the boy dangling from one of the tree's lowest branches, his feet barely a foot from the ground. His wrists were bound by what appeared to be thick rope. The same thick rope had then been wrapped tightly around the center of the wide branch, forcing the boy to hang by his arms. Both his shoulders bulged in their sockets, as if they were about to break free from the rest of the boy's body. The boy appeared to be around the same age as me, but I didn't immediately recognize him from school. He was nearly nude, wearing nothing more than his tighty-whitey underwear, which was far from tight and far from white. I then noticed that a pile of clothes had been discarded beneath the boy's feet, and at once figured that they had been his. His sandy blonde hair was disheveled. I assumed that his face was normally a similar pale complex as the rest of him, whenever it wasn't covered in splashes of dirt and mud. Even though the boy's eyes were wide and filled with fear, I could clearly see their bright blue. They were nearly as crisp a blue as the sky had once been. 3 long gashes had been carved across the boy's chest. I could see the ripped skin and the fresh streams of blood that flowed like narrow rivers towards his waist. As he noticed me, the boy began to kick his legs around. He tried to scream, but silver duct tape covered his mouth, keeping his tongue at bay. He was calling for me to help him, but I didn't get the chance to try, because all of a sudden, a man was there. I hadn't noticed anyone other than the boy, so I can't say for certain exactly where the man came from. The tree line? Another possible trail that I couldn't see? I don't know. All I did know was that 1 minute there was just the boy hanging from the tree, And then out of nowhere, a strange man wearing a well-soiled black hoodie and filthy blue jeans was walking towards the boy from my left. He had long, light brown hair that nearly fell down to his shoulders. The tips of his hair had been dyed bright pink. I only caught a brief glimpse of the man's face before he turned away from me to face the hanging boy, enough to observe that his face was hidden from the nose down by a black half mask. At his side, gripped with dark black gloves, the man was holding a freshly bloodied hatchet. The hatchet was small, simple, with a long black handle. It looked more like a throwing hatchet, one hurled at wooden targets for points, instead of a tool used for any type of actual work. Somehow the strange man hadn't noticed me. By some miracle, I had not been seen. I should have taken advantage of that moment to run away, to get the hell out of there. But I didn't. I stayed, and I watched. For a few seconds, the strange man merely stood in front of the hanging boy, his head cocked sideways like a curious dog. He then began to run the fingers of his free hand across the boy's wounded chest, back and forth, up and down, as if the blood was paint and he was creating a masterpiece. A muffled, frightened scream erupted from the young boy as his short legs and bared feet began to kick wildly at the man. A few of the kicks hit the man, but he seemed unfazed by them. After completing his painting, the strange man took a step back from the boy. Without warning, the hatchet was swung and violently sunk deep into the boy's belly button. Shrieking filled the field, and I did my best not to scream myself at the sudden ferocity. The man then pulled the hatchet free before swiftly plunging it again into the boy's stomach. Hastily, the man dropped the hatchet to his feet, before pushing one of his hands through the newly formed opening in the boy's torso. The man began to tear out part of the boy's insides, throwing them to the ground next to the boy's discarded clothes. The boy's howling rose for a second before falling lower and lower. His kicking became slower and weaker. I watched as the boy's blue eyes rolled back into his skull, and spasms viciously shook him from head to toe. It didn't take long before the boy was dead and hollowed out like a pumpkin at Halloween. Before I knew what was happening, the strange man had turned around and rushed at me. He knew the whole time that I was there, that I was watching his brutality. I could smell the stench of the boy on him. The odor of blood and insides came off him in disgusting waves of filth. I still did not run though. At the time, I didn't understand what it was that kept me in that field, even as the strange man and I stood face to face. It wasn't fear. It was something else. As I was given an up-close view of the man's face, two things immediately stood out. The man was not that old. I could tell by his skin, its firmness and lack of wrinkles. But most importantly, I could see his eyes. They weren't the crisp blue like the dead boy, but a forest green with speckles of gold. There was just something about them that was familiar. Something that I recognized. I also got a good look at that half mask that was covering the man's mouth and chin. It was made of a rough black cloth that was wrapped around the man's head, front to back, like a bandana. The back of the half mask was hidden from view, tugged away beneath the man's long hair. Across the front of the cloth was a picture of fake lips, which sat over top of the strange man's real lips. The fake mouth was closed, permanently sewn shut by a thick white thread. I watched the black cloth begin to shift as the man's real mouth began to move.
"Did you like it?"
He growled.
"Did you like what you see?"
I didn't answer.
"Do you like what you see?"
He repeated, his voice growing more aggressive. That was when I ran. I fled from both the child killer and his strange question. As I descended the steep hill, I could hear the man several feet behind me, chasing me, his heavy feet stomping against the path. He would catch me. He would string me up too. I just knew it. But he never did. He remained within arm's reach the entire stretch of the new path, his rapid breathing nearly on my neck. But he never got me. Why? If I hadn't been wearing my backpack when I left school, He could have easily grabbed it. He had been that close. I pushed the question away as I abruptly swung my body left and onto the original Hatchetman trail. I never slowed or faltered until I broke the tree line and a familiar brown apartment building came into view. Birds were singing, the sun was shining, and the sky was at once again a brilliant blue. I continued home in a slow daze, unsure if what had happened had been real. It had to have been real, right? Or had it been all in my head? Had I been imagining it? Or had I broken from reality? When it was happening, it all felt completely real. But as I stepped up to the front door of my apartment, it also seemed like a fading dream. Still moving slowly, I pushed open the front door of my home and went casually inside. A pungent stench was there to greet me. It was different from what had been wafting off the child killer, but I at once knew it to be the aroma of death mixed with the recognizable odor of cigarette smoke. Following the stench, I found my mother in the living room, lying on the couch. I had hoped that she would be sleeping when I got home, but I didn't expect her to be sleeping that deeply. Drying mucus and a weird white foam was beginning to form a layer of crust on her gaping mouth. Splotches of fresh vomit covered her chest and shirt. Her eyes were open, empty. I clearly smelled piss and shit. I followed the smoke in the air to the cigarette that was still burning on the coffee table. It was nearly gone, but a faint red ember remained. At the sight of the cigarette, the spots on my arm healed or otherwise began to itch. I was scratching them when I spotted the empty bottle of liquor sitting next to the ashtray. She normally didn't finish the whole bottle of booze until the end of the day, but it hadn't been the liquor that killed her, I was sure, and it definitely hadn't been the tobacco. Whatever she had injected herself with had done the job. I could see the needle that still hung from her arm, like a young boy hanging from a tree. I can't say how long I stood there staring at her lifeless body, burning cigarette, fresh vomit. My mother hadn't been dead long. She might have even been dying at the same moment the young boy was being gutted. If I hadn't taken Hatchman Trail and gotten home sooner, I might have been able to help her. She might have lived. A smirk formed. Good. I wouldn't have pissed on her if she had been on fire. Taking my time, I found my mother's cell phone and called the police. The next day or so was a blur. I never said anything to the cops about the boy and his killer. It didn't matter right then and then. I still wasn't sure if it had been real. If it had been real, I was sure the police would find out at some point. They didn't need me to do their job. So, why am I telling you all of this? Why am I taking you with me on this trip down memory lane? I am not trying to justify what I have done. No. And I don't expect you to understand. Not really. I just want you to see it for what it really is. After my mom died, social services tried like hell to find my father. His name wasn't on my birth certificate, and all of my mother's family was either dead or unable to be located. Except for her one brother, someone that I never knew existed. My mother had always said she was an only child. Liar. My uncle hadn't known the name of my father either. My uncle lived deep in the mountains of West Virginia, 6 or more hours from Ohio. He was a nice enough man and was able to give me a place to stay. He was much older than my mother, and far less angry or aggressive. I was often defiant and we normally butted heads, but I never had any new burn marks after that. Only fading white ovals. Something from that day in the woods stayed with me, however. I slowly became more and more obsessed. I had always been a loner, but I somehow became even more withdrawn, totally isolated from absolutely everything. I couldn't shake the hanging boy from my thoughts. The man's strange question echoed over and over inside of my mind, becoming louder and louder.
Do you like what you see?
I searched online almost daily for any news about a boy being hung up and gutted in Ohio. I found nothing though. Nothing at all. And then one day, as I was looking at myself in the mirror, my reality shifted, and everything made perfect and clear sense. The man's familiar eyes, forest green, speckles of gold. His eyes were suddenly staring back at me in the mirror. They were my eyes. For the 3 years following my mother's death, I had physically changed, like most teenagers do. I not only had an exceptional growth spurt, shooting up over 6 inches, but I had let my hair grow out as well. It was light brown and long, nearly falling to my shoulders. Without consciously realizing it, I had transformed into the same man that had been haunting my thoughts. I was him, and he was me, all along.
Do you like what you see?
Yes. Yes, I did. My uncle hates the pink tips in my hair, but he got over it. I found the hatchet and the half mask at a local Walmart. You see, detective, it had been fate. When you find this note, I will have killed my third young boy. I am not done yet. I cannot quit until I have the exact blonde boy hanging from the exact tree in the middle of the exact field on top of the exact hill. It will happen one day. I know because I have already seen it. And when everything is perfect and the fates are aligned, a 14-year-old will appear as a witness, and the circle will continue to go around and around. What is going to happen has already happened, and what already happened is going to happen. It is a cycle that neither one of us can break. And don't think that you can use this note to figure out who I am. All of what I have told you is true, all except for one detail. I never grew up in the town of Oak Hill. I don't even know if a place by that name even exists in Ohio. I know that you will keep trying to catch me, detective, and you may at some point, but not until I have completed my destiny. Sincerely yours, Hatchetman.